So, I'm here to introduce the next session, Invention to Impact. Not many people can say with a straight face, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, but those who work for the National Science Foundation may be the exception. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Andrea Belz, Division Director of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships at the National Science Foundation. In her current role at NSF, Dr. Belz manages America's Seed Fund, powered by the NSF Innovation Corps, also known as I-Corps, Partnerships for Innovation, Industry, University Cooperative Research Centers, IUCRC, don't try and pronounce that. Previously, Andrea served as Vice Dean for Technology, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship in the University of Southern California Viterbi School of Engineering, as well as Entrepreneur in Residence for Technology of Industrial and Systems Engineering. She's worked with many university startups and investors, most recently representing a major angel investing group on the board of a Caltech spin-off laser manufacturer until its acquisition in 2018. For nearly 20 years, Dr. Belz has advised universities, corporations, and other organizations on commercialization opportunities as managing member of the Belz Consulting Group. After Dr. Belz has concluded, she will take questions from the audience. As before, there are several microphones around the room. Please approach the mic to ask your question. So please now welcome Dr. Andrea Belz.
Good morning. It's really an honor to be here with you. It's also a pleasure because I don't usually have the opportunity to give any kind of a speech in my cowboy boots. So I would like to thank you all for that opportunity. I had the pleasure of teaching a course in Austin and learned that that's how you teach. So I am so excited to be here with you today. I want to talk for a few minutes about inspiration behind why we at NSF care deeply about this topic of commercializing research. I'll tell you a little bit about the institution and how it is that we operate, a little about the specific programs that you just heard in the introduction, and then a little flight of imagination on some of the changes that we see coming in industry. But first, just by a show of hands, how many of you are generally familiar with the NSF or have been funded by NSF over the years? Excellent. So my introduction to NSF is short. So first I want to tell you a little bit about firms and what we know. We know that new firms create new jobs. These are data from the Kauffman Foundation, and the top line in blue shows the jobs created by firms that are less than 5 years old. And then the red and the yellow lines are the next 5-year windows. And even if you track with the economic crisis, what you see is that consistently new companies create new jobs. We also know that startups are really disproportionately engines of growth. They are linked to this creation of roughly 1.5 to 2 million jobs annually, but they struggle to attract private capital, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. But this is the chart that has caused some concern. These data actually go back 40 years. The x-axis starts in 1977, and what you see is that even though there are all these wonderful tools to create jobs more easily, including the development of LLCs and online forms, et cetera, consistently there's been a drop in the number of startups that are created. And I think this is not well appreciated that in the 70s the creation rate of new companies was much higher. So there's a decline. That's a concern. We also know that venture capital in the last few years has really fled the world of hardware. So these data are from Thomson Reuters and PricewaterhouseCoopers, and what they show you is that the orange line on the top, oh, I did that by mistake. The orange line is the funding of internet companies, and you can see the big dot-com peak, and then you can see that over the last few years that funding has really been restored to previous levels. The blue is healthcare, and then the black and red lines on the bottom are the industrial and electronics sectors. What you see is that they never really recovered from the dot-com crash. And so funding has really declined in those fields, and it's interesting because even 15 years ago in the venture capital world, if you wanted a sure bet, you invested in hardware. And today what we see is that the reverse is true. So these are the same data, but showing it to you in some numbers. And I also want to take a moment to thank the AV team who helped me when we discovered this chart was not right an hour ago. But if you look at the circled numbers, the electronics numbers and the software numbers, what they show you is that in electronics, over a 20-year period, the number of deals grew by 40% and the funding by 3x. But in the software world, the deal volume grew by 4x and funding in that region grew by 20x. So there are more deals and the deals are bigger in software. The migration of capital from electronics and instrumentation and what was considered classic hardware deals has really been accelerating in a consistent fashion. We also know that we live in a constantly refreshing economy. It's one of the wonderful characteristics of living in this great nation. And what we see is that the average lifespan of companies continues to drop. So this tells you what is the average lifespan of a company on the S&P 500 index. And what you can see over the last 40 years, is that this trend has been declining, but that it's projected that the average lifespan will get even shorter. So companies will form, they'll launch, go public, and then ultimately end in some fashion. It could end by acquisition, it could end in some other way. And we also know that only 2 companies from the S&P 100 remained on it 100 years later. So this question of corporate lifespan is really interesting because it's both feeding and a recipient of the development of new startups. And yet we know that the number of startups is going down. So we actually would like to see this trend continue. Some of you may be familiar with the world of private capital. I understand that there were some talks about that yesterday. But this chart shows you how investor appetite for risk has changed. And what you see is that data that go from 2010 to 2017, showing you how many of the companies getting funded at early stages have revenues already. So in 2010, roughly 10% of the seed and Series A companies had revenues. And 7 years later, it was more than half. So even to get early stage funding, you already need to have sales. So all of this speaks to a really interesting investment environment. We see that investors are leaving the world of hardware. They are not going to take chances necessarily on these companies that are pre-revenue. The issue with that, from our perspective, is that we know that angel and venture groups contribute, but that venture capital funded ventures in particular commercialize faster. So there's a greater need for capital during this early stage funding gap if you're building things and not just software. And even integrated systems struggle because if you have a deal, for instance, an Internet of Things type of deal, where you have a software component and a hardware component, it's much harder to get funding for those deals as well. Another element to this ecosystem is questions revolving around intellectual property. So we know, first of all, that intellectual property has a great multiplier. These data from a couple of years ago suggest that we spend $300 billion on R&D, the output is $6 trillion. Now you can say, well, look, that R&D isn't feeding that output because it takes many years to commercialize it. And that is the point, which is that if we don't invest today in R&D, we won't have the benefit of that output 10 years from now. And this is a study from the US Chamber of Commerce. So we know that intellectual property has a significant multiplier in output. We also know that IP is recognized in the public markets. So these data show you how intellectual property plays into market cap. And in 1975, which is the far left, roughly 83% of a company's market cap could be accounted for by its tangible assets, property, plant, and equipment. And the remainder, 17%, was wrapped up in intellectual property, patents, goodwill, branding, etc. And 40 years later, that number had flipped. The majority of the market cap is now represented by intangible assets. So we know that intellectual property is a very important component of the stock market picture. And this is an interesting statistic that was presented in congressional testimony several years ago, which is that an estimated 30% of the NASDAQ exchange's value comes from university-based, federally funded research. And I know I'm going through a lot of different data, but I want us all to see what this jigsaw puzzle looks like, right? We have to uncover all the pieces and find the corners so that we can build the puzzle. So the last piece of data come from a study that I did for the National Academies a couple of years ago, which is a question of who does what kind of research. So the blue lines are the basic research, and you can see on the left that the universities predominantly do basic research, as we know. Red is this intermediate level of applied research, and green is development, so that's advanced development activities. And you can see, of course, that industry is where most of those development activities happen. But how do we hand off between universities and industry? Is that handoff smooth? The y-axis is the same in both of these charts, so the order of magnitude is the same for that intermediate valley of death level of technology development. So we can ask the question, how do we do the handoff? Do we do it efficiently? Are there things that we can do better? So if you put all of this together, you end up with a map of what we do in our division, which is we want to create jobs in young companies. We know that's where new jobs live. We want to address the fact that venture capital risk has really changed over the last 20 years, and you saw some of the changes even in the last few years with respect to the revenues required in order to get funding. We know that the pace of disruption is accelerating. Intellectual property has a major multiplying effect. And finally, we know that universities are really important as reservoirs of intellectual property. So if you put all of that together, what you discover is that it's very interesting for the federal government to help precipitate the development of new startups. And so that is what our focus is in the organization where I live at NSF. So if you go back to basics with NSF and you understand what our mission is, it is to promote the progress of science, all of these wonderful words, and sometimes this is articulated as health, wealth, and stealth. We support the national infrastructure in many different ways, but our vision is to be a global leader in research and innovation. And our director has said very clearly that she expects for partnerships to be really important, not just in advancing the commercialization of research, but even in helping to envision and inform paths of research in the future. So I'm not going to go into NSF in great detail. Our budget is on the order of $8 billion. We fund technologies across the board, basically everything short of clinical trials. You will hear from my colleague from NIH later who can speak to that more. And of that basic research, the Division of Industrial Innovation and Partnerships has a $270 million budget focused on translational research. And our number one priority is to generate real impact. Many of you know the NSF has a long-standing commitment to understanding what the potential impacts are from the research that we fund, and a lot of that happens in the funding activities of our division. So if we look at what do we do to support the nation? We really see ourselves as having four major activities. We educate, accelerate, demonstrate, and translate. And you can say, well, those are words, but what does that really mean? Well, what it means is that we are really addressing very concrete sets of risks. People think that if you work with startups, and I know many of you here may have experience with startups, people say, oh, you love risk when you're in the startup world. And the truth, I see someone shaking his head, no. So the truth, of course, for those of us who spent time in that world is that we are terrified of risks. We work very deeply to manage risks and identify them, but loving risk is really not quite the right word. So how do we do this? We focus first on skills gaps. We accelerate, which means that we're worried about market risk and whether a technology is precisely defined in order to meet real market needs. We worry about technical risk. That's what our demonstration program is about. And we worry about financial risk in terms of translating a technology to market, especially in the context of these venture capital numbers that I showed earlier. And so we have a number of programs that we can really map very well onto this set of risks that we are working to mitigate on behalf of the nation. So one nice thing about this division is we can ask ourselves, does it matter what we do every day? And so this is a company that was founded by a recently graduated Ph.D. student from Carnegie Mellon. It is facial recognition and machine learning, and it has been used to identify victims of human trafficking online in both understanding structured and unstructured data in order to find these victims. We've also funded Ginkgo Bioworks. You may have heard of this as a major synthetic biology company. We were the first money into the company. They've now been valued at over $1 billion. And it's basically biological factories. You can think of those petri dishes as factories making various kinds of fragrances and other organic products. Blue River is another great example. They were funded by our small business program, and during the course of their award, they were building a system to integrate machine learning and computer vision. And while they were still being funded by us, they accidentally got acquired by John Deere for $300 million. So we like those kinds of accidents. What I'd like to do is briefly introduce you to some of our programs. So many of you may be familiar with SBIR and STTR. We invest roughly $200 million a year in a number of different technologies. Again, you can see that we are responsible for covering all of the technologies that are covered by NSF. It's up to $1.75 million for a given company. And the most salient point here is that you can find out if you have a concept that is suitable for funding by us by submitting a very short project pitch. We have a quick web form that gets evaluated by a program officer to say, yes, this is a good fit for NSF, no, it's not. It's not a full proposal. The full proposal, of course, is subject to all of the NSF criteria. So these are some of the statistics of our phase 1, the initial phase of funding. 91% have never had a phase 2 award. 85% of our firms have 5 or fewer employees. 72% founded in the last 3 years. So we really have focused very heavily on startups in order to generate this kind of impact for the nation that we are desiring. And then our portfolio, we're very excited to see the success of the companies that we fund, which is over $7 billion in follow-on institutional funding. So we really work to have impact. Some of you may be familiar with the I-Corps program. I-Corps is intended to answer these kinds of questions. If I'm building something, does it matter? Does it matter? Who's interested in this? And our job is to teach scientists that the answers are not in the lab, they're not even on campus. What this program is not is selling, pitching, writing business plans. What this program is a focus on product market fit. Some of you may be familiar with the term. There are $50,000 grants that basically help scientific teams understand how to apply the scientific process to doing industrial discovery and understanding industrial needs. We are always looking for mentors. I'll just put that out there. You heard about the unpronounceable acronym, IUCRCs. This is a partnership where we support the operations of a virtual center where industrial members participate and sponsor research that's pre-competitive and of broad industrial significance. And so the key here is that the students get internship opportunities. We fund centers in all types of technologies. Again, it's an NSF-wide program. And I am apologizing that I am going through this in a blitz, but hopefully if some of you are interested, I can talk for a long time about these programs. So Partnerships for Innovation is really our principal prototyping vehicle. It's again open to any technology area covered by NSF. We have a couple of different tracks for funding depending on the partnership structure that you anticipate. And it's now coupled with the I-Corps program that you just learned about, so that if you're going to be developing something in the lab, we want you to understand clearly what are the industry needs that you're addressing. And then finally, we have these intern supplements, which is $55,000 for 6 months of internship for a graduate student or a postdoctoral fellow so that they can get some non-academic internship experience. I think many of you know, if you've had students, that not all of your students will follow you into academia. And so if some of them are interested in getting a little industrial experience, this is a way to do that without impacting the progress of your research grant. So these are supplements on NSF awards, and open to students regardless of citizenship requirements. We've had 550 students do this in the last couple of years. Please join us, help us make this number even bigger. You heard in the previous talk about the importance of inclusion and diversity, and NSF is deeply committed to enhancing the diversity of the scientific enterprise and making sure that it reflects the great nation in which we live. We have a new initiative on this front that's based on 3 factors: affinity, community, and opportunity. So affinity is where we identify affinity groups and partner with them in delivering introductory experiences in innovation education. Our pilot project is with the GEM Consortium, which has historically placed underrepresented minority engineering students in graduate programs around the country. We are working with them now in providing introductory innovation education as well. So that's the community part, and then opportunity is that we hope to start funneling these students into I-Corps experiences or the internship program so that we can support their growth. So this is the release of the information about the GEM Consortium. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about cool things we see happening. One is digital neurology. So we think a lot about artificial intelligence, but if you think about the human system, we have a lot more than our brain that is operating. So for instance, we talk about edge computing, where if you're in an autonomous car, you don't want it to have to wait for data to get sent up to the cloud and back. So there's obviously going to be some onboard processing. There's a great physical analog for that, or biological analog. It's the reflex system. And so if you think about how our neural system works, you will see all of the different branches that you need to build on top of artificial intelligence. Some of it will be sensory replication and new sensors. Some of it will be processing data and creating metadata. There's been an estimate that something like 90% of the data in the cloud are actually metadata, data about the other 10%. And understanding human interactions, these 2 things go together. When I meet you, it's not just my facial recognition system that's working. I remember, hey, your daughter was applying to college, and you owe me a lunch, and all of these other wonderful items that are classified as metadata. So I think our artificial intelligence systems are very far from doing what we can do very intuitively right now. We, of course, are harvesting lessons from nature all the time. We can think of the development in solar cells as basically artificial photosynthesis, harvesting mechanical energy from wind. We have seen birds do that for many years. We can see all kinds of new technologies coming with how we make things in the biological factories I talked about earlier, personalized therapeutics, the photonic sensors that can do all kinds of different analyses now, 3D printing of metal. So there's lots of stuff happening in this space. And then finally, threat detection. We have many open doors in our society. Open doors typically require locks. And so everything from biological detection to quantum computing, we see those as growth areas for us. Here are our asks. Number 1, we are interested in talking to people about mentoring. We're always looking for new reviewers for our panels. And of course, if you have friends doing interesting things, ask them to submit a proposal to us, please. And then we're always looking for more insight also on industrial needs. Just join us in creating new opportunities for the American research enterprise. So, the need to support commercialization of deep technologies is profound. There are many data that support this. NSF supports basic research in all disciplines, and our division leads the translational efforts. We support this through many different programs, and we're really proud of our portfolio. We can say that we really are working to transform technologies and industry today. Contact me if you'd like to talk about getting involved in any way, and thank you for your time. I believe there is time for questions, or maybe not. If I did it right, there's no time for questions.
I have one if I can squeeze it in. Richard Gibbs from Baylor College of Medicine. Thank you, that was terrifically informative. The NIH, of course, has many programs in personalised medicine that are getting more and more technical. I wonder if you could say a few words about the boundaries between your portfolio in personalised medicine and development of that area versus the NIH.
Yes, I'm very pleased that my colleague Matt McMahon is here with us today, also from NIH, so he can talk about that side of the fence. A very easy way to draw the line is at clinical trials. We don't do anything having to do with clinical trials. We're really interested in a lot of the infrastructure around this. So for instance, development of new instrumentation, development of reagents. Those kinds of infrastructure and platforms that are needed are right in our wheelhouse. We just announced a new topic in our SBIR program on pharmaceutical technologies because we see that we're doing so much to support that enterprise. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
You did a great job in 25 minutes covering all kinds of
Thank you.
different projects. One particular IUCRC where we want companies in infrastructure, particularly companies that are involved with the buildings. It's very difficult.
That are involved with what, sorry?
The companies that are involved with the buildings, because the overall infrastructure is a very diversified field. So it's very difficult to get them to come in because they want the results in 1 or 2 years. Sometimes it takes 3 or 4 years. Do you have any way of, any good words how we can get more companies involved?
So the IUCRC program actually has a provision for a planning process where there is a small grant to help do 2 things. One is get the university team to participate in a boot camp and a workshop so that you can learn how to effectively have those kinds of discussions. And the second is to be able to invite industry members in for a planning workshop. And so if you're concerned about that process, the best thing to do is actually apply for a planning grant and go through the process. You'll see that there are lots of different ways you can think about talking with industry. But I agree with you, obviously that's a challenge.
That was great talk. One of the things I was interested in is you mentioned the lack of investment in hardware. And even with startups getting going, sometimes they don't have the resources for hardware. How much of the portfolio is looking at getting some of these ideas connected to large companies that might have the resources or even equipment and infrastructure to be able to develop a hardware technology?
So we do see a significant amount of interaction directly with industry. The reality is, as you say, for many of those kinds of technologies, the corporate strategic partners are the ones who are going to be in for the long haul. They can also provide not just funding, but also insight from the business units to really inform the details of the technology development. That happens consistently across all of our technical disciplines and throughout the portfolio. There is a lot of interaction on that front. We also have a boot camp for our SBIR awardees to help them learn how to start having those kinds of conversations. Thank you.